7 people boarded that shuttle, knowing the risks of space travel. What they didn't know, what they were never told, was that their own engineers had begged the night before launch for the mission to be scrapped. Not because of weather, not because of equipment failure, because of a rubber ring the size of a bracelet, and because the people in charge decided that schedule mattered more than 7 human lives. This is not just the story of an explosion. This is the story of what happens when the people who know the truth are told to sit down and stay quiet. January 28th, 1986, Cape Canaveral, Florida. The temperature that morning was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch day in NASA's history. Ice had formed overnight on the launch structure. Ground crews spent hours trying to clear it. In the stands, thousands of people had gathered to watch. Schools across America had their televisions on. Because this launch was different. For the first time ever, a civilian was going to space. Christa McAuliffe was a 37-year-old high school teacher from New Hampshire. She had been selected from over 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space program. She was going to teach 2 live lessons from orbit, broadcast to classrooms across the country. Her students were watching, her family was watching, the entire nation was watching. And somewhere inside the buildings, behind that launch pad, a group of engineers were watching too, with dread in their stomachs. Because they had spent the entire night before trying to stop this launch from happening. The night before launch, engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, got on a conference call with NASA management. Their concern was the O-rings. O-rings are rubber seals that sit between the sections of the rocket boosters. Their job is simple: prevent hot gases from escaping. In warm temperatures, they work perfectly. They're flexible. They compress and seal under pressure. But in the cold, they stiffen. They lose their ability to seal. And if they fail, hot gas escapes exactly where it shouldn't. Roger Boisjoli, one of the lead engineers, had actually written a memo 6 months earlier warning that this could happen. He had laid it out in detail. He had called it a potential catastrophe. Nobody had acted on it. Now, on the eve of launch, with temperatures forecast to drop below freezing, Boisjoli and his team were telling NASA directly, do not launch tomorrow. The data was clear. Every O-ring incident in shuttle history had occurred in lower temperatures. The colder it was, the worse the seals performed. They had charts. They had evidence. They had engineering logic on their side. NASA's response? When do you want us to launch next April? The frustration in that room was real. NASA had already delayed this mission multiple times. The media was starting to mock them. A school teacher had been sitting in quarantine waiting to go to space. The pressure to launch was immense, and so NASA managers did something extraordinary. They told the Thiokol engineers to take a break from the call, and then they told Thiokol management, not the engineers, the management, to make a decision. What happened next is one of the most damning moments in the history of American engineering. Thiokol's vice president, Jerry Mason, looked at his senior engineer, Joe Kilminster, and said, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. The engineers were overruled. Kilminster signed the launch recommendation. Roger Boisjoli sat in silence. He knew what was coming. The next morning, Challenger sat on the launch pad. The crew suited up. They joked with technicians. Christa McAuliffe smiled for photographs. She had no idea what had happened the night before. None of the crew did. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the engines ignited. Slow motion footage captured something in the first seconds of launch that would only be understood later. A puff of dark smoke from the lower joint of the right solid rocket booster. The O-ring had already begun to fail. For the next 73 seconds, Challenger climbed into a clear blue sky. The crew reported systems were normal. Mission control confirmed throttle up. Everything appeared perfect. Then at 73 seconds after liftoff, a flame breached the joint. It burned through the external fuel tank. Liquid hydrogen ignited, and Challenger broke apart at 46,000 feet, traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound. The explosion was visible for miles. In the stands, parents covered their children's eyes. In classrooms across the country, teachers stood in front of televisions, not knowing what to say. All 7 crew members were killed. Investigators later determined that the crew compartment survived the initial breakup. The astronauts were likely alive for the 2 minutes and 45 seconds it took for the wreckage to fall into the ocean. That detail has never stopped being devastating. In the days that followed, NASA's public statements were careful, measured. They spoke about the tragedy, the investigation, the commitment to safety. What they didn't speak about was the phone call the night before. The engineers who had raised objections were not celebrated for their warnings. They were marginalized. Al McDonald, the Thiokol engineer who had physically refused to sign the launch recommendation and documented his objections, was removed from his position on the shuttle program shortly after the disaster. Challenger. The message was clear. Speaking up had consequences. But the truth has a way of surfacing. When the Presidential Commission, the Rogers Commission, was formed to investigate, they called in witnesses from every level of NASA and its contractors. What they found was a pattern of ignored warnings, bureaucratic pressure, and a culture that treated safety concerns as obstacles to be managed rather than problems to be solved. And then came the moment that changed everything. Richard Feynman was one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century. He was also deeply impatient with bureaucratic nonsense. During the commission hearings, while others were preparing lengthy presentations, Feynman did something simple. He took a piece of O-ring rubber, he clamped it, and he dropped it into a glass of ice water. After a few seconds, he removed the clamp and showed the commission what happened. The rubber had lost its elasticity. It didn't spring back. It stayed compressed. In that moment, with a glass of water and a piece of rubber, Feynman demonstrated publicly what NASA management had been trying to minimize. The O-ring didn't work in the cold. It never had. They had known. They had launched anyway. His conclusion, added to the report almost as a footnote because NASA tried to suppress it, was devastating. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. The engineers had been right all along. NASA grounded the shuttle program for 32 months. Roger Boisjoli, the engineer who had warned about the O-rings and then watched his warnings be ignored, suffered a severe breakdown. He eventually left the industry, spending years giving lectures about ethics in engineering, telling anyone who would listen what it cost to tell the truth inside a system that didn't want to hear it. Al McDonald, who had refused to sign the launch recommendation and been punished for it, was eventually reinstated. He went on to lead the redesign of the solid rocket boosters, making them significantly safer. He spent the rest of his career ensuring that what happened to Challenger would not happen again. Most of the managers who made the decision to launch faced no serious professional consequences. NASA flew the shuttle again in 1988 and continued the program until 2011. But the culture that had allowed Challenger to happen was never fully fixed. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated during a re-entry. A piece of foam had struck the heat shield during launch. Engineers had flagged the concern. Management had dismissed it. 7 more astronauts were killed. The parallels to Challenger were so exact, they were almost unbelievable. Different failure, different decade, same system, same silence. Among everything that was lost on January 28, 1986, there is one story that carries a particular kind of weight. Christa McAuliffe had planned 2 lessons to teach from space. She had prepared them carefully. She had a genuine belief that ordinary people, teachers, students, anyone, could be part of exploration. That space wasn't just for astronauts and scientists. It was for everyone. She never got to teach those lessons. Her backup, Barbara Morgan, had trained alongside her. After the disaster, Morgan returned to teaching, but she never let go of the mission. In 2007, 21 years later, Barbara Morgan flew to the International Space Station aboard shuttle Endeavour. While in orbit, she spoke to students in Idaho and answered their questions about space. Christa McAuliffe's lesson was finally taught, not by the person who was supposed to teach it, but because of her, because of what she believed, because her dream was worth carrying forward, even after it cost her everything. The Challenger disaster was not a technical failure. It was a human failure, a failure of communication, of culture, of courage, the courage it takes for people in power to hear something they don't want to hear and act on it anyway. The engineers did everything right. They ran the analysis. They raised the alarm. They documented their objections. And they were overruled by people who were worried about optics, about schedules, about a watching world. 7 people died, not because the technology was unknown or because the risk was unforeseeable. They died because the right people were told the wrong message at the wrong time. That their job was not to prevent the launch, but to approve it. Every organization, every team, every company, every institution faces the same choice Theocol management faced that night. When someone brings you information you don't want to hear, you can dismiss it or you can listen. Challenger is what happens when you don't listen. If this story made you think differently about how decisions are made under pressure, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into the moments in history where human judgment shaped everything, subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Stories that don't just tell you what happened, but why it matters right now.